Welcome to Unit 8. In this unit we're going to discuss the use of passives. What's the problem? In a nutshell, it's the incorrect use of the passive in legal writing. If you cast your mind back over to the previous units, I've argued that we should use the subject-verb-object structure in legal writing. This, as I'm sure you're aware of by now, is called the active voice. The subject is known and is doing something to someone or something. It's easy for everyone to understand. In contrast to the active voice, we also have the passive voice. We can use the passive voice, but only when rules allow us to use it. Unfortunately, in legal writing, these rules are very frequently abused, as writers generally follow the outdated or simply incorrect belief that the passive is formal or lawyerly, and it's the correct voice for legal writing. Why is this a problem? If the passive voice is used incorrectly, at best it leads to increased word count, at worst it leads to a complicated sentence structure which will make the reader's life harder or even lead to the reader being confused. As mentioned, writers use the passive thinking it is professional, legal or businesslike. However, it's wrong to think of the passive as a structure which achieves those aims. Just like nominalizations, the passive puts distance between the doer and its act and creates an abstract situation from a real situation. It's this sense of abstract and depersonalization which might allow someone to think it's formal. All it does, however, is create room for interpretation and therefore possibly misinterpretation and confusion. What's the solution? Simple. Use the passive form, but only when rules allow us to. How? Well, there are three rules to bear in mind. Use the passive if the thing being done is more important than the doer, if the doer is unknown, or if you need to create distance between the doer and the doer's act, for example, to avoid blaming someone or for the purposes of the doer's secrecy. Take a second to look at the example sentence and see if you can apply those rules. Before we begin, let's break down the sentence. We can easily identify the court as the subject, the doer of the action. The subject has to do something, so let's find the verb. In this case, we have to free the verb from the nominalization, and we can identify the object. One last thing just before we go through the rules. I fully understand the lack of overall context could lead you to disagree with what I'll say next, but bear with me. Rule number 1. Is the court's action more important than itself as the subject? I would argue no. The use of the passive and the nominalization hide what the writer is really trying to say. The basic message focuses on the court doing something, not the action itself. Rule number 2. Is the subject unknown? Well, as mentioned before, we can clearly see it's the court. Rule number 3. Is it important to create distance between the subject and its act? No. In fact, we have to stress that it is the court that's doing something. This sentence, which is drafted in the passive, then fails all three rules. The sentence could easily be redrafted. If the court appoints an expert to write an opinion, it would significantly add to the cost. This example sentence further reinforces the need to avoid nominalizations. Because the writer focuses on the nominalization, it forces the writer to use the passive. Going back to the rules, we can break the rules into two groups, subjective and objective. Rule number 2 is objective. If you don't know what the subject is, then of course you have to use the passive. There's no arguments there. Rules 1 and 3, however, are subjective, and these are the rules which you have to think about carefully. Does the situation which you're writing about actually allow the rules to be subjectively applied? Well, this is entirely down to you, but I would ask you to think about that decision carefully. There is a simple way to identify possible misuse of the passive, which we also met in Unit 1, and that's to find in your writing the use of by, which introduces a subject if it's a person, or with if it's an inanimate object. For example, he was struck on the head with a hammer. If by or with is used to identify the subject, we can automatically eliminate rule number 2, and in many cases, rule number 1 as well, as you'll ask yourself, is the action really more important than the doer itself? You can identify by or with quite easily if you use Ctrl+F in Word or other computer programs. You can then review each use to see if it's introducing an unneeded passive. Let's recap. When using the passive, think about the 3 rules presented in this unit. If the use of passive is justified, use it. If not, stick to the subject-verb-object structure. Now we know what the problem is, why it is a problem, and how to fix the problem, we can now test the rule by doing the questions below. However, if you're unsure about any of the points which I've made, please go back and watch the video again. Feel free to pause the video to review all examples at your own speed. After you do a question below, you can click to see a suggested answer. Just before you get started though, please note the following. Please read the question and the hint carefully to make sure you complete the questions properly. Don't just get stuck into the questions, read what you have to do first. In the suggested answer, there may also be further comments to a particular question, so please read these comments carefully. The suggested answers are just that, suggested. There may of course be other also correct ways to answer each question. I've tried to put in as many variants as I can, but for obvious reasons I can't write every single correct answer. So, as long as your answer follows the main points highlighted in the suggested answer, your answer should be okay. The questions are designed to practice the rule in this unit. So, although you can make further corrections to the rest of the text based on the other rules in the course, the answer only concentrates on the rule in this unit. And finally, please don't get lost in the legalities of the question text. It's there only to provide material to practice the rule, not to be a law lesson. All that being said, off you go.